Hello there! 8 years ago I made a closed planted ecosystem by taking a bit of existing ecosystem from a local pond, putting it in a jar, adding some plants and closing it airtight. In the following years I updated you a bit on how it was doing, but the last update was 5 years ago. So let's change that today. Welcome to Life in Jars. Before we see the ecosystem in its current state, let's take a quick trip down memory lane for a brief history of this ecosphere. Well, I say brief, but this is the first thing I'm recording and you know me, so we'll see how it turns out. Alright. 2 days after it was closed, we could see what was going on. The plants planted in this jar were Vallisneria from my tropical aquarium. These plants already had some algae growing on them, and these algae, together with the algae present in the water and sediment of the pond, would, together with the plants, provide the ecosystem with oxygen while taking up carbon dioxide, which is a critical function in a small closed environment that has no gas exchange with the atmosphere. The first animals we could see were crustaceans, like this ostracod or sea shrimp and this copepod, which is carrying eggs. Another crustacean we could see were the Daphnia. Apart from the crustaceans we saw another critter, though not actually an animal. This fuzzy sphere that contracts when disturbed is a colony of single-celled organisms, Forticella or bell animalcules. 8 years ago I told you that this was Cartesian polyponum. That could be true, but I'm not totally sure. It could also be a different species. 2 months later, the ecosystem was doing great. The populations of all the inhabitants were growing. The Vallisneria propagated itself and an entirely new plant started growing. The amount of ostracods had grown considerably and algae were starting to grow on the glass. The thread algae on the plants had grown a lot and also spread to the glass. The copepod population had grown as well and the Forticella colonies had spread around the jar. So everything was going great. In fact, a new species that we hadn't seen before appeared as well, this larger species of ostracod. Pretty exciting. Over the next 2 months, this positive trend continued. The first new Vallisneria had grown as tall as the original two were, and not one but 2 young new plants were coming up. The large species of ostracod that appeared 2 months earlier had grown considerably in numbers, just like the smaller species had before. While rewatching the 4-month update video, which I made over 7.5 years ago by now, I relearned an interesting fact for myself, which I'll gladly share with you. There's a lot of different ostracods. Some have sexual reproduction, with distinct males and females, while others only have hermaphrodites. There are also species, however, that have hermaphroditic and male individuals, and no females. This is called androdioece. Pretty wild, right? Oh, and males of all ostracods have 2 penises. The Daphnia were happily bouncing around, and the smaller ostracods maintained a large population, while the algae were covering more and more of the glass. Sadly, however, I didn't see the Forticella colonies anymore at this point. When the ecosystem was 7.5 months old, some of the Vallisneria, the original ones, started dying. The new ones were doing fine, but weren't getting big. It seems the plant adjusted to the lower bioload in this ecosystem compared to the one they came from. At the same time, which was either a cause or effect, or merely a coincidence, the number of animals went down a lot as well, and at this time the Daphnia had gone extinct. In its place came a new species though, an aquatic mite. It must have been hiding in the sediment for all this time. Or maybe it hatched from a dormant egg, triggered by the warmer temperatures. The thread algae was taking on interesting shapes on the glass. A little over 2 months later, the algae seemed to be benefiting immensely from the nutrients freed by the decomposition of some of the plants. When the planted ecosphere was 1 year old, the population of both the ostracod species were larger than they had ever been before. It seems that a lot of dying plant leaves was a bit of a shock to the system. Now that all the dead leaves have been decomposed and there is a higher concentration of nutrients in the water, a new stable balance has formed, with room for more animals. Hopefully a more stable equilibrium. The original plants were almost gone, but the ones quote-unquote born in this jar were small and healthy. This was also the first, and so far last time, I ever saw an ostracod molting. I didn't see the mite again, nor the copepods anymore, so it seems that after a year, this ecosystem was comprised of Vallisneria and algae, 2 species of ostracod and various microbes. That's quite a low biodiversity, but this jar was never very biodiverse in the first place. When this ecosystem was 2 years old, more of the Vallisneria had died. There were 3 left, 2 of which had started to grow in a way I've never seen before or ever since, growing very small leaves, and a lot of them. They seem to be adapting to this unique and I imagine challenging environment. The other one was very small, but still growing in a familiar way. Apart from this curious plant behavior, not much has changed. All the same species were still present, though there did seem to be a bit less of everything. Over the next year, this trend continued. There was only one big plant left, and if I didn't know it was a Vallisneria, I would never recognize it as such. It also did something I never saw before or once again since. It split in 2. This was really strange, but also really cool to see happen. Its environment didn't allow it to grow like it normally would, so it had to do something different in order to survive. I said the only big plant, even though it's not big at all, because there's 2 other very tiny Vallisneria. Tiny little leaves coming out of the ground. This rock was getting covered by cyanobacteria, which is a good thing because this way there were primary producers taking over for the slowly disappearing plants. Both ostracod species were still present, but there weren't a lot of them. There couldn't be because there wasn't much plant life to support them. The amount of plant and animal life in a closed ecosystem is always correlated, unless that animal is a very competent herbivore or the plant releases deadly toxins. It has to be, as plants support animal life and animals support plant life. So after 3 years, the ecosystem still seems stable, but the amount of life seems to have gone down steadily for 2 years. That's the most recent information about this ecosystem for you. Until now. In the summer of 2024, when the ecosystem was 6.5 years old, the ostracod population completely exploded. There were more in there than there had ever been before. That happened this summer as well, but for whatever reason I didn't film it this year. It's probably because of the increased light. This allows for more algae growth. More algae can support more animals by providing them with both sufficient food and oxygen. And going to the present, this is what our once planted ecosystem looks like after 8 years. After all this time, the Vallisneria had finally gone extinct, and the planted ecosystem was planted no more, meaning that the burden of supporting animal life was resting completely on the algae's shoulders, as the only remaining primary producers. As we saw 1.5 years prior, they are very much capable of doing this, because in the summer of 24 the plants were already gone. These crustaceans can only survive because of the algae. Without them, they would starve, suffocate, and potentially even be poisoned over time by their own waste products and the waste products of their waste products. So thanks, algae. But where are they? Unlike in almost all the other ecosystems I've ever made, there's no green to be seen. No green tint in the water, no green film on the glass, and no green growth coming from the sediment. So what's up? Well, it seems that the algae that are supporting this entire ecosystem are microscopically small, and there aren't many of them. They're most likely unicellular algae suspended in the water column, and although the water isn't green, it's also not crystal clear. It has a slight haze or cloudiness to it, similar to what you'd get if you were to mix a teaspoon of milk into a large glass of water, something everyone's all too familiar with, I'm sure. So that's where our primary producers are hiding, which could also partly be cyanobacteria, by the way. There aren't that many in this system, meaning they can't support that much animal life. And indeed we don't see much animal life. We only have these ostracods at this point. The smaller species went extinct. The ones you're seeing now are the only ones left. They have the same shape as the larger species initially present, but they're much smaller. This leaves us with three options. 1. There has always been a third species present, which was never really abundant and therefore went unnoticed all this time, but which has been able to outcompete both the smaller and larger species. Option 2. The large and small species started crossbreeding and the hybrid species had a higher fitness, outcompeting both present species. Or option 3. This species is the same species as the large one, but changed its growth form to better suit this enclosed environment, similar to what the Vallisneria went through, except cooler because it would have happened over multiple generations, instead of just being the phenotypical plasticity of one individual. In other words, it would have evolved. Well, three very exciting hypotheses. Even though it's very unlikely that I would miss an entire species altogether while observing these ecosystems so closely, I still think the first option, with a third species, is the most likely. There are 63 confirmed freshwater and brackish ostracod species in the Netherlands, with about 20 more expected to be present. I don't know which species the smaller and larger ones were, but I do know I've seen both of them in other projects. So I started thinking, have I seen the one we're seeing now somewhere before? Well, the species that appeared after rehydrating a completely desiccated ecosystem looked very similar. But looking more closely, I think it's not actually the same species. And in the larger dried ecosystem, a different species altogether appeared. So it seems that even though two species are the most abundant, there's actually quite a variety of species appearing in my ecosystems. This makes the first option seem more likely. The second option, hybridization, seems unlikely. The two species differed greatly in size for one. I also couldn't really find any satisfactory scientific literature describing hybridization of freshwater ostracods, or even ostracods in general. However unlikely, I cannot confidently rule it out though. The third option would of course be totally awesome, evolution. I'm honestly not really sure how likely this is. Ostracods are often used in paleontology and evolutionary studies, and their body size is affected by environmental factors. Unfortunately, I haven't found any experimental studies on body size variability of ostracods though. I did find one recent paper discussing the relation between body size of the fresh and brackish water species Cyprideus sterosa and certain environmental parameters, but apart from seasonal changes and a possible correlation with salinity, they didn't really find anything. I'll link this paper and a list of all Dutch ostracod species in the description in case you want to have a look. My gut feeling says option 3 is also very unlikely, but I'm still not going to rule it out. There is one more piece to this puzzle though. It just so happens that I made another closed ecosystem using materials from the same location at around the same time in an identical container. The natural ecosphere, the first one I ever made. I'm not going to show too much of it in case I decide to give it its own dedicated update video, but this ecosystem has the same species in it. And it also still has the smaller species. This still doesn't rule out any of these three hypotheses, not even necessarily the second one. However, the chances that hybridization or evolution happened independently in two different ecosystems and still resulting in a very similar phenotype are so low that we can be almost certain that we're simply dealing with another species that flew under the radar before. In case none of that meant anything to you, let me just say, look at these cute little silly tiny animals. There is something interesting going on in this ecosystem. Over time, the biodiversity in this ecosystem went down. This makes sense as the population of any given species is limited, increasing the chances of a species going extinct. And once they are, that's it. there's no migration in or out the jar. This has, in this case, resulted in our simple ecosystem containing just two species, algae and ostracods. For simplicity, we're ignoring the microbes. The algae support the animals and the animals support the algae. As long as there's enough algae for the animals to live and vice versa, their absolute numbers shouldn't matter. Let's say you need 1 unit of algae per unit of animals. Then it shouldn't matter if there's 4 units of each or 24, as long as it's balanced. And we've seen this happen over time, with the amount of life fluctuating, seemingly in correspondence with the seasons the last few years. With the plants going extinct around 2 years ago though, there are less primary producers to support the animals, unless the algae are able to use the nutrients that were once used by the plants. I guess we'll just have to see in the future. I think that's all I wanted to say about this ecosystem for now. It has lived on my windowsill for 8 years now. 8 wonderful years. The second closed ecosystem I ever made. And therefore, to me, regardless of any other projects that are maybe more biodiverse, one of the coolest. Thank you very much for joining me on this fascinating journey. And unless I change my planning and this isn't the last Life in Jars video this year, I wish you a happy new year. Well, I wish you a happy new year even if there's another video. Or if this one comes out in January. Or if you're watching in the middle of July, well, I wish you a happy year. And also if you follow a different calendar. You know what? Just take your happy new year and get out! Goodbye!